For millennia, the grand pyramids of Egypt have towered over the desert sands, casting long shadows across a history that was once lost to the winds. Everything about the great ancient civilization that once seized these lands remained a mystery to the modern world. That is, until July 19, 1799, when a French soldier discovered a large stone near Alexandria, unearthing a written language that had been dead for thousands of years. These translations proved to be the key to unlocking the secrets of an entire civilization. Our story begins not with the pharaohs we know, but with the geology of the land itself. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. That is what Herodotus, the father of history, once said. The river provided the water for the cultivation of crops, leading to the burgeoning of civilization along the Nile Valley. When the valley began in the Miocene times, various geographical resources contributed to the state's foundation. Annual floods spread fertile soil to the east and west, building up mud deposits over centuries. This made Egypt one of the first agricultural communities that ever existed in human history. But before the farmers, there were the wanderers. At the end of the Paleolithic era, production flourished with arrows, harpoons, and pottery. Scattered tribes lived in shacks and huts made of reeds and solid mud. They sowed corn on the muddy soil of the Nile marshes. In the Fayum Oasis, a natural basin southeast of the Giza Plateau, the Fayum A civilization emerged between 9000 BCE and 6000 BCE. These people lived near a vast lake, making their living through hunting and fishing. They constructed reed homes with subterranean basements for food storage, but as the population grew, the tribal way of life began to consolidate. Communities shifted from teeny wandering bands to large groupings of diverse tribes living in the same region. Tribal chieftains assumed positions of power which were passed down through family units. The Merimde culture thrived in the western Nile Delta, where granaries were made of clay jars buried in the earth. In Lower Egypt, the El Omari culture built circular homes with plastered mud walls. However, the real momentum was gathering in the south. The Badarian culture lived in movable tents, but preferred fixed homes. This led to the Amratian period, also called Naqada I, where complex homes were built with windows and hearths. By 3500 BCE, the practice of mummification began. Burial items were left with the deceased to aid them in the next life. The Gurzian culture, also called Naqada II, launched trading with distant regions, inspiring massive changes in art. Houses were now built of sun-baked brick. The city of Abydos became an important burial location, forming a necropolis, a city of the dead. Tombs were originally mud bricks, but were later built of limestone. By this time, the cities of Thinis and Hierakonpolis were considered ancient. The hieroglyphic alphabet was invented around 3400 BCE for maintaining records. Small villages evolved into bigger urban centers that soon clashed for trade products and water. Thinis, Naqada, and Nekhen were the three principal city-states of Upper Egypt. But peace was not the goal of the rising leaders. Thinis appears to have defeated Naqada before absorbing Nekhen. These battles were fought by the legendary Scorpion kings. Scorpion I died, passing his ambition to Scorpion II, who struggled to extend his reach northward. He was followed by King Ka, who consolidated the southern territories even further. Ka's reign moved the kingdom to the very edge of total unification. However, the final step required a warrior of unprecedented vision. Around 3150 BCE, King Nama ascended to the throne of Upper Egypt. He was likely from Thinis or Hierakonpolis, and he was determined to rule the entire length of the river. Nama launched a massive military operation into Lower Egypt to quell revolts and seize the delta. He married the princess Neithhotep of Naqada in a political arrangement to strengthen the links between the two major towns. But conquest was not enough. He needed a symbol of total authority. Narmer became the first monarch to be represented wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt. He wore the hedjet, the white crown of the south, and the deshret, the red crown of the north. Together they formed the shant, the double crown that denoted sovereignty over the two lands. Narmer's victory was not just a military triumph, but the birth of a nation. He sponsored massive construction projects and encouraged urbanization across his new domain. The divine rule of the monarch had officially started. A distinct Egyptian culture emerged, including the advancement of writing, arts and sciences. Narmer died in 3100 BCE, leaving a unified kingdom to his son Hor-Aha. But the challenges of keeping two different worlds together were only just beginning. Hor-Aha ascended to the throne in 3100 BCE, succeeding his father Narmer as the second ruler of the first dynasty. He understood that a unified land needed a central heart, so he founded the city of Memphis at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. This city was designed to be the administrative hub of the burgeoning empire, protected by massive white walls. But ruling a newly unified nation was no easy task. Hor-Aha spent much of his reign leading military expeditions against the Nubians in the south. He also fostered the development of religious rituals, establishing a temple to the god Neith in the delta. Hor-Aha died in 3050 BCE, leaving the throne to his son, Dje-Air. Dje's reign was a time of consolidation and immense territorial expansion. He led his armies across the Sinai Peninsula to secure valuable copper and turquoise mines. But his power was not just felt in war, it was seen in the staggering scale of his burial. When Dje died in 3000 BCE, over 300 retainers were sacrificed to accompany him into the afterlife, a grim practice of the early dynastic period. The crown then passed to Dje, whose reign was relatively brief and shrouded in mystery. Dje's sudden death left the kingdom in a precarious position, as his son, Dien, was still a small child. However, the boy's mother, Mernith, stepped into the void, ruling as regent and becoming the first powerful woman in recorded history. Mernith maintained the stability of the state until Den was old enough to take the throne in his own right. King Den proved to be one of the most capable rulers of the era, reigning for nearly 50 years. He was the first monarch to use the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt, solidifying the concept of the dual monarchy. But Den was also a warrior, famously depicted smiting the east in ivory carvings found in his tomb. He reformed the administration and conducted the first census of the nation's wealth. Upon Den's death in 2935 BCE, his son Anegib took the throne, but his legitimacy was immediately challenged. Anegib struggled to keep the northern and southern factions of the court from drifting apart. His reign was cut short by Semerkhet, often viewed by historians as a usurper. Semerkhet's rule was marked by omens and great calamities, according to ancient records. He died in 2916 BCE, passing the crown to Ka, the final king of the first dynasty. Ka's long reign of over 30 years provided a brief period of peace and artistic growth. When Ka died in 2890 BCE, he left no clear heir, and the kingdom descended into a brief but violent dynastic struggle. Order was restored by Hatshepsut, who founded the Second Dynasty. His name literally means "the two powers are at peace," suggesting he ended the civil strife between the rival factions. Hatshepsut moved the royal burial grounds from Abydos to Saqqara, overlooking his capital at Memphis. The peace was fragile, and his successor Raneb faced continued internal pressure. Raneb was the first king to incorporate the sun god Ra into his name, signaling a shift in religious focus. He was followed by Ninetye, whose reign lasted nearly 40 years and saw the division of the kingdom for administrative purposes. However, this division eventually led to a total collapse of central authority. By 2740 BCE, the kingdom was fractured once again, with different kings ruling in the north and south. The ruler Seth-Peribsen made a radical move, replacing the traditional falcon of Horus with the beast of Set on his royal crest. This religious upheaval caused massive turmoil across the Nile Valley. The chaos was eventually quelled by the arrival of a final great unifier, Khâsekhemoui. Khâsekhemoui defeated the northern rebels in a series of bloody battles, reportedly killing 47,000 enemies. He changed his name to reflect the reconciliation of the two gods, Horus and Set. Khâsekhemoui built massive mud brick enclosures at Abydos and Hierakonpolis, the largest structures of their time. He died in 2686 BCE, having firmly re-established the borders and the bureaucracy of Egypt. But as the Second Dynasty ended, the era of mud brick was about to be replaced by the era of stone. The stage was set for the architects of the Old Kingdom to reach for the heavens. The death of Khâsekhemoui marked the end of an era, but his successor would elevate the nation to heights previously unimagined. In 2686 BCE, Djoser ascended to the throne, marking the beginning of the Third Dynasty and the dawn of the Old Kingdom. Djoser was not merely a king, he was a visionary who sought to immortalize the royal spirit in a way that mud and brick never could. He commissioned his brilliant vizier and architect, Imhotep, to design a tomb that would dwarf all others at the necropolis of Saqqara. Imhotep stacked 6 stone mastabas on top of one another, creating the world's first step pyramid. This limestone giant stood nearly 200 feet tall, a literal stairway to the stars for the king's soul. But Djoser's reign was also marked by hardship, including a legendary 7-year famine that he supposedly ended by making offerings to the god Khnum. He died in 2648 BCE, passing the throne to Sekhemkhet, who attempted to build an even grander pyramid. However, Sekhemkhet's reign was tragically short, and his buried pyramid was left unfinished and lost to the desert sands. He was followed by Khaba, whose own layer pyramid remained a mere skeleton of stone. The dynasty concluded with Huni, who reigned for 24 years and sought to consolidate the southern borders by building a series of small forts. But as Huni's life faded in 2613 BCE, the crown passed to his son-in-law, Sneferu, the founder of the Fourth Dynasty. Sneferu was a relentless builder and a master of logistics. He launched massive trade expeditions to Lebanon for cedar wood. He was the first king to experiment with the true smooth-sided pyramid design. His first attempt at Maydum ended in structural failure when the outer casing collapsed under its own weight. But Sneferu was undeterred, and he moved his labor force to Dashur to begin the bent pyramid. When the angle proved too steep, his architects adjusted mid-construction, which gave the monument its unique, stunted appearance. Finally, Sneferu achieved perfection with the Red Pyramid, the first successful, smooth-sided pyramid in history. He died in 2589 BCE, having moved more stone than any other pharaoh, and he left a stable and wealthy empire to his son, Khufu. Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, was a ruler of absolute authority and singular focus. He chose the Giza Plateau as his canvas, commissioning a monument that would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Over 20 years, thousands of conscripted laborers moved 2.3 million stone blocks to construct the Great Pyramid. But Khufu's reputation in later folklore was that of a tyrant who closed the temples and forced his people into grueling labor. Whether loved or feared, he solidified the pharaoh's status as a living god on earth. Upon Khufu's death in 2566 BCE, his son Djedefre took the throne, but his reign was brief and shadowed by family intrigue. Djedefre moved away from Giza to build his pyramid at Abu Rawash, perhaps to distance himself from his father's legacy. He was soon succeeded by his brother Khafra, who returned to the Giza Plateau with a vengeance. Khafra built the second largest pyramid, which appears taller than the Great Pyramid because it sits on higher ground. He is also credited with the carving of the Great Sphinx, a colossal guardian with the body of a lion and the face of the king. Khafra's reign marked the peak of imperial prestige, but the cost of those massive projects was beginning to drain the royal treasury. He died in 2532 BCE, and the throne passed to Menkaure. Menkaure was remembered as a more pious and just ruler than his predecessors, but his pyramid was significantly smaller than those of his father and grandfather. He began to use granite from Aswan, a much more difficult material to transport and to carve. Menkaure died before his monument was finished, and his successor Shepseskaf had to complete it in haste using mud brick. Shepseskaf broke with tradition, refusing to build a pyramid and choosing instead a massive sarcophagus-shaped stone tomb at Saqqara. That choice signaled a growing tension between the monarchy and the rising power of the priesthood. By 2494 BCE, the Fourth Dynasty, the age of the giant pyramids, had come to an end. The bloodline of the pyramid builders had thinned, and a new group of kings claiming direct descent from the sun god Ra was ready to seize control. The Fifth Dynasty began in 2494 BCE with the ascension of Uzarkaf, a king whose reign signaled a profound shift in the spiritual heart of Egypt. Uzarkaf was the first to build a sun temple at Abu Sir, which became the new sacred center for the monarchy. He moved away from the Giza Plateau and elevated the god Ra above other deities. Ra was now worshipped directly through a rising priesthood, and the king's role as the sole representative of the divine began to subtly diminish. Uzarkaf died in 2487 BCE, and the throne passed to Sahure. Sahure is remembered as one of the most capable monarchs of the era. He was a pioneer of trade and exploration, launching the first recorded Egyptian expedition to the legendary land of Punt. His ships returned laden with myrrh, electrum, and exotic animals, enriching the royal treasury and the temples of Ra. He also led military campaigns against Libyan groups in the west and against Sinai tribes in the east to secure Egypt's borders. Sahure died in 2475 BCE, leaving a prosperous kingdom to his son Neferirkare Kakai. Neferirkare was a pious ruler who introduced the prenomen, or throne name, further linking the pharaoh's identity to the sun god. During his reign, the temple bureaucracy swelled, and the priesthood of Ra gained unprecedented influence over state affairs. The king was no longer the undisputed master of Egypt's wealth. Much of it was now diverted to maintain the sprawling sun temples. Upon Neferirkare's death in 2455 BCE, the throne passed to Neferefre, whose reign was tragically short and whose pyramid was left as an unfinished stump. He was followed by the elusive Shepseskare, whose brief rule is a shadow in the historical record. Stability returned with Nusere Ini, who reigned for over 30 years and completed the monuments of his predecessors at Abu Sir. Nusere Ini consolidated power by marrying his daughters to powerful provincial officials, a move intended to secure loyalty. That policy had a hidden cost. It elevated the status of local families who would eventually challenge the crown. Nusere Ini died in 2422 BCE, and the throne passed to Menkauhor Kaiu, the last king to build a sun temple. Djedkare Isesi succeeded Menkauhor Kaiu. He was a reformer who realized the central government in Memphis had become too bloated. Djedkare decentralized the administration and gave more authority to regional governors known as nomarchs. He also sent a second expedition to Punt to maintain the flow of luxury goods that sustained the court's splendor. As Djedkari's life faded in 2375 BCE, the crown passed to his son Unas, the final king of the 5th dynasty. Unas built a modest pyramid at Saqqara, but its interior contained a truly revolutionary development: the pyramid texts. These were the world's oldest religious writings, carved into the walls to ensure the king's resurrection and his dominance in the afterlife. But despite his spiritual preparations, Unas died without a male heir in 2345 BCE, leaving the throne to a commoner named Teti. Teti founded the 6th dynasty and sought to restore the absolute prestige of the pharaoh. He married Unas's daughter Iput to legitimize his rule, but he lived in a state of constant paranoia. His fears were justified. Teti was eventually murdered by his own bodyguards, an act of regicide that would have been unthinkable in the 4th dynasty. The throne was briefly seized by the usurper Userkare, who may have been behind the assassination plot. However, Userkare was quickly ousted by Teti's son, Pepi I, who reclaimed his birthright and reigned for 50 years. Pepi I was a vigorous ruler who reorganized the military and conducted multiple campaigns into the Levant. But he was also forced to navigate a series of harem conspiracies, including a plot by one of his own queens to overthrow him. He survived the turmoil and was succeeded by his son Merenre Nemtiemsaf I, who focused on expanding trade with Nubia. But Merenre's reign was short, and when he died in 2278 BCE, the crown was placed on the head of his 6-year-old half-brother, Pepi II. Pepi II would go on to have the longest reign in human history, sitting on the throne for an incredible 94 years. In his youth, he was a curious king, famously writing to an explorer to ensure a dancing dwarf from the south reached the palace safely. But as the decades wore on, Pepi II became a frail and ineffective monarch, outliving his children and his heirs. As he aged, the central government in Memphis began to wither away, and the nomarchs across Egypt seized the opportunity. These local governors no longer sent their taxes to the capital. They built grand tombs for themselves and ruled their districts like independent kings. The royal treasury was decimated, and the central authority that had built the Great Pyramid was now a mere ghost. When Pepi II finally died in 2184 BCE, he left a kingdom that was bankrupt and fractured. The dynasty limped along under Merenre Nemtiemsaf II and a mysterious queen named Nitikret. But nature dealt the final blow. A massive drop in the Nile floods led to a catastrophic famine that the dying crown could not stop. The old kingdom, the age of the god kings and the mountain builders, collapsed into dust. Egypt was no longer a single nation, but a collection of warring states where a loaf of bread was worth more than a crown. The darkness of the first intermediate period had begun. The central authority that once commanded thousands to build mountains of stone had evaporated into the heat of the desert. With the death of Pepi II, the 7th dynasty began, though it was a dynasty in name only. Manetho, the ancient historian, famously wrote that this era saw 70 kings who ruled for 70 days. This was a time of total systemic collapse, where the divine order of Ma'at had been replaced by a bitter struggle for survival. But the collapse was not just political, it was environmental, as the low Nile floods led to mass starvation and the abandonment of once thriving villages. The 8th dynasty attempted to maintain the illusion of power from Memphis, but their names are little more than a list of shadows. As the Memphite kings withered, a new power emerged in the city of Heracleopolis in Middle Egypt. A local governor named Keti I, also known as Aktoes, declared himself the true king of Upper and Lower Egypt. He founded the Ninth Dynasty and was described by later historians as a man more cruel than any who had come before him. But his authority was never absolute, and his descendants in the 10th dynasty struggled to keep the northern nomarchs in line. However, a rival power was simultaneously rising in the south, centered around the city of Thebes. The nomarch of Thebes, Intef Was, grew tired of the Heracleopolitan claims and declared himself a rival pharaoh. He founded the 11th dynasty, seizing the southern provinces and setting the stage for a century of civil war. Intef Was died in 2118 BCE, passing his ambition and his small kingdom to his brother, Intef II. Intef II was a warrior king who reigned for over 50 years, slowly pushing his borders northward against the Heracleopolitan forces. He captured the sacred city of Abydos, a major symbolic victory that claimed the heart of the Egyptian religion for the Thebans. But the war was a grinding stalemate, with neither side able to deliver a final, crushing blow. Intef II died in 2069 BCE, passing the throne to Intef III, who continued to consolidate the southern gains. During this time, the instruction for King Merikare was written in the north, a literary masterpiece reflecting the cynicism and wisdom of a fractured age. But the Heracleopolitan kings were losing their grip as their vassals in the delta began to defect or fall to nomadic invaders. The struggle for the soul of Egypt finally reached its climax under the reign of Intef III's son, Mentuhotep II. Mentuhotep II ascended the Theban throne in 2061 BCE and spent the first 14 years of his reign in relative peace. But in his 14th year, a rebellion in the Thinite nome gave him the excuse he needed to launch a full-scale invasion of the north. His armies swept through Middle Egypt, laying siege to Heracleopolis and eventually toppling the 10th dynasty. But the victory was bloody, as evidenced by the mass grave of 60 slain soldiers found near his tomb, each bearing the scars of a desperate battle. By 2055 BCE, Mentuhotep II had done what no man had achieved for over a century. He had reunited the two lands. He was hailed as the second Nama, the man who brought order back to a world of chaos. Mentuhotep II moved the capital permanently to Thebes, signaling that the era of Memphis was over. But as the first intermediate period ended, the scars of the Dark Century remained. The new kings of the Middle Kingdom would have to rule differently, knowing that the crown was no longer untouchable. Mentuhotep II had achieved the impossible, dragging a fractured Egypt back into the light of unity. He was no longer just a king of Thebes, he was the master of the entire Nile Valley, from the Delta to the first cataract at Aswan. But his reign was not just about war, it was about the restoration of the Egyptian soul and the rebuilding of a broken administration. He spent the latter half of his 51-year reign establishing a new bureaucracy that answered directly to the palace in Thebes. He commissioned a magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a structure that combined the traditional pyramid with terraced colonnades. Mentuhotep II died in 2010 BCE, passing the throne to his son, Mentuhotep III. Mentuhotep III inherited a stable kingdom, and he immediately focused on securing the borders against Bedouin raids from the east. He sent a massive expedition of 3,000 men into the Wadi Hammamat to quarry fine stone and to re-establish trade routes to the Red Sea. But his reign lasted only 12 years. He died in 1998 BCE, leaving the crown to the mysterious Mentuhotep IV. Mentuhotep IV is often excluded from later king lists. which suggests his reign was viewed as illegitimate or troubled. He sent his powerful vizier Amenemhat on a final expedition to the stone quarries of the eastern desert. Shortly after, Mentuhotep IV disappeared from history, and the throne was seized by his vizier. Amenemhat I ascended to the throne in 1991 BCE, founding the 12th dynasty and ushering in the true golden age of the Middle Kingdom. He was a commoner by birth, a usurper in the eyes of the old elite, and he knew his position was precarious. To secure his dynasty, he moved the capital from Thebes to a new, more central location called Itj Tawi, which means Caesar of the two lands. But Amenemhat I feared the very bureaucrats he had installed, and he took the radical step of appointing his son, Senusret I, as co-regent. This ensured a smooth transition of power, a practice that would define the stability of the 12th dynasty for centuries. But even with his son at his side, the king was not safe within his own palace walls. In 1962 BCE, while his son was away on a military campaign in Libya, Amenemhat I was assassinated by his own palace guards. The story of this betrayal and Senusret's race back to the capital is immortalized in the story of Sinuhe, a classic of Egyptian literature. Senusret I took the throne and immediately launched a series of brutal retaliations against those who had conspired against his father. He was a builder and a conqueror, extending Egypt's reach deep into Nubia to seize the gold mines of the south. He constructed a line of massive mud brick fortresses along the Nile to protect the southern trade routes. Senusret I died in 1926 BCE, passing the crown to his son, Amenemhat II. This period was marked by an unprecedented expansion of international trade, with Egyptian artifacts found as far away as Crete and Mesopotamia. However, the wealth of the kingdom was also being used to buy the loyalty of the provincial nomarchs, whose power was growing once again. Amenemhat II was followed by Senusret II, who turned his attention to the Fayum oasis, a marshy region that he drained to create a vast new agricultural heartland. Fayum became one of the kingdom's great breadbaskets, but the delicate balance of power between the king and the local lords was about to be shattered by the greatest of the Middle Kingdom rulers. Senusret III ascended the throne in 1878 BCE and proved to be a monarch of iron will and terrifying focus. He was the first pharaoh to be depicted with a face of realistic exhaustion, reflecting the heavy burden of his office. Senusret III conducted 4 bloody campaigns into Nubia, crushing all resistance and establishing the border at Semna. His most significant victory was domestic. He systematically abolished the office of the nomarch, stripping the local families of their hereditary power. He centralized all authority in the hands of the king, creating a state that was more organized and more powerful than ever before. Upon his death in 1839 BCE, the crown passed to his son, Amenemhat III, who inherited a kingdom at the absolute peak of its prosperity. Amenemhat III reigned for nearly 50 years, continuing the agricultural works in the Fayum and building the Labyrinth, a mortuary temple so vast the Greeks later claimed it had 3,000 rooms. But as the long reign of Amenemhat III came to a close in 1814 BCE, the strength of the bloodline began to falter. His successor, Amenemhat IV, ruled for less than a decade and died without a male heir. In a desperate move to maintain the dynasty, his sister Sobekneferu ascended the throne. She was the first woman to rule Egypt with the full titles and regalia of a king since the distant days of the Old Kingdom. But Sobekneferu's reign was short, lasting only 4 years, and she left no successor to carry on the 12th dynasty. By 1800, 2 BCE, the golden age of the Middle Kingdom had vanished as quickly as it had arrived. The centralized state that Senusret III had built was now a prize for anyone strong enough to take it. But while the Egyptians fought amongst themselves, a group of foreigners from the east were quietly settling in the delta. They were the Hyksos, and they were bringing a weapon that would change the face of Egyptian warfare forever. The collapse of the 12th dynasty was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing slide into irrelevance. In 1802 BCE, Wagaf ascended to the throne, marking the beginning of the 13th dynasty. But unlike the iron-willed kings who preceded him, Wagaf and his successors were often mere figureheads, ruled by powerful viziers and military commanders. The throne changed hands with dizzying speed. Kings ruled for months rather than decades, their names flickering briefly in the records before being extinguished. However, despite this instability, the administrative machinery created by Senusret III continued to function for a time, holding the nation together by sheer momentum. But the central authority in Ichtawi was failing to notice a growing threat in the north. For generations, Semitic-speaking peoples from the Levant had been migrating into the eastern Nile delta, settling in the city of Avaris. They were merchants, craftsmen, and mercenaries, and they were slowly becoming the dominant power in the region. Around 1725 BCE, a local dynasty of these settlers, known as the 14th dynasty, declared independence from the pharaohs in the south. The kingdom was now officially split, with the true pharaohs in Ichtawi and the upstart Canaanite kings in the delta. But the worst was yet to come. Around 1650 BCE, a group of foreign invaders known as the Hyksos swept into the delta. They did not just settle, they conquered. The Hyksos brought with them technologies that the Egyptians had never seen: the composite bow, the horse-drawn chariot, and superior bronze weaponry. Saladin, the first Hyksos king of the 15th dynasty, seized Avaris and eventually captured the ancient capital of Memphis. But he did not destroy Egyptian culture. He adopted it, taking the title of pharaoh and claiming the protection of the god Set. However, his rule did not extend to the south. In Thebes, a line of native Egyptian rulers known as the 16th and 17th dynasties held on to a precarious independence. They were forced to pay tribute to the Hyksos kings in the north, a humiliating arrangement that simmered for generations. The Hyksos king Apophis ruled from Avaris with a combination of military might and diplomatic cunning. But his arrogance would eventually lead to his downfall. Apophis sent an insulting message to the Theban king Sekenenretau, claiming that the noise from the hippopotamuses in Thebes was keeping him awake hundreds of miles away. It was a blatant provocation, and Sekenenretau accepted the challenge. He launched a war of liberation, leading his Theban armies northward against the Hyksos occupiers. The fighting was brutal, and Sekenenretau died in battle. His mummy shows the horrific wounds of axe blows and dagger stabs to the head. The crown passed to his son Kamose, who was determined to finish his father's work. Kamose rejected the advice of his cautious counselors, who were content to live in peace as vassals. He declared that he could not sit comfortably while his land was shared with an Asiatic and a Nubian. Kamose launched a daring naval raid up the Nile, capturing Hyksos trade ships and laying siege to Avaris itself. Kamose died suddenly in 1550 BCE, before the final victory could be secured. The weight of the revolution fell upon the shoulders of his young brother, Ahmose I. Ahmose was barely a man, but he possessed the tactical brilliance and the relentless drive needed to end the occupation. He spent years rebuilding the Egyptian army, incorporating the very chariots and bows that had once defeated his ancestors. Thutmose launched a three-pronged assault on Avaris, finally breaking the Hyksos defense and driving the foreigners back into the Levant. He did not stop at the border. He pursued them into Canaan, besieging the fortress of Sharuhen for 3 years to ensure they would never return. By 1550 BCE, Egypt was unified once more under a native king. The Second Intermediate Period, the era of the foreign shadow, was over. But the trauma of the occupation had fundamentally changed the Egyptian psyche. The kings of the new kingdom would no longer be content with isolation behind their desert borders. They would become the masters of the known world, building an empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the Sudan. Thutmose had broken the foreign yoke, but the Egypt he inherited was a land scarred by a century of occupation. He knew that the old ways of isolation were dead, and that to survive, Egypt must become a predator rather than prey. Thutmose spent the remainder of his reign rebuilding the decimated temples and restoring the ancient administration. He established the cult of Amun-Ra at Thebes, elevating a local deity to the status of a national supreme god. But his greatest legacy was the professionalization of the Egyptian army, turning it into a permanent elite fighting force. Thutmose I died in 1525 BCE, passing the throne to his son Amenhotep I. Amenhotep I was a king who preferred the architect's plumb line to the soldier's spear. He spent much of his 21-year reign expanding the great temple of Karnak, turning it into a massive stone testament to the power of Amun. He also founded the royal tomb builders village at Deir el-Medina, creating a specialized guild of craftsmen to carve the eternal homes of the gods. But peace was not universal, and he still led military expeditions into Nubia to secure the gold flow that fueled the economy. Amenhotep I died in 1504 BCE, leaving no male heir and threatening to plunge the nation back into dynastic uncertainty. The transition was saved by a commoner general named Thutmose, who had married into the royal line. Thutmose I ascended the throne and immediately proved that the blood of a commoner could burn with the fire of a conqueror. He was a man of restless energy and boundless ambition. Thutmose I led his armies further than any pharaoh before him, crossing the Euphrates River in modern-day Syria. He erected a victory stele on its banks, marking the northernmost limit of the Egyptian empire. In the south, he pushed past the third cataract of the Nile, crushing the kingdom of Kush and bringing vast quantities of ivory and gold back to Thebes. Thutmose. I was also a pioneer in death. He was the first pharaoh to be buried in the secluded Valley of the Kings. He abandoned the visible pyramid for a hidden tomb, hoping to escape the tomb robbers who had desecrated the monuments of the Old Kingdom. Thutmose I died in 1493 BCE, passing the crown to his son, Thutmose II. Thutmose II was a physically frail ruler, plagued by illness and perhaps overshadowed by the strong-willed women of his court. He married his half-sister Hatshepsut to bolster his claim and secure the Thutmoside bloodline. During his brief reign, he suppressed a minor revolt in Nubia, but it was his generals who led the charge. His most significant act was fathering a son with a secondary wife, a boy who would eventually become one of the greatest warriors in human history. When Thutmose II died in 1479 BCE, that boy was still an infant, far too young to rule. The stage was set for a power struggle that would produce one of the most remarkable and controversial rulers the world had ever seen. The Queen Regent was about to do the unthinkable, and she was about to take the crown for herself. Hatshepsut began her journey not as a king, but as a protector of the bloodline. As the boy's aunt and stepmother, Hatshepsut took the role of regent, managing the affairs of state with a steady hand. She was the daughter of the great conqueror Thutmose I, and the fire of Thutmosid ambition burned in her veins. She was not content to remain a shadow in the palace, while the priesthood and the generals looked to a child for leadership. In the 7th year of her regency, she made a move that shattered centuries of tradition. She discarded the title of queen and declared herself pharaoh, the absolute ruler of the two lands. To secure her legitimacy, she claimed that she was the literal daughter of the god Amun, who had visited her mother in a cloud of incense. Hatshepsut was depicted in statues wearing the traditional royal kilt, and even the false beard of the kings, signaling her total authority. However, she did not seek her glory through the slaughter of enemies or the expansion of borders. Her reign was defined by the scent of exotic spices and the rhythmic sound of the mason's chisel. She launched a massive building program, the likes of which Egypt had not seen since the days of the pyramid builders. Her greatest achievement was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a masterpiece of classical architecture. It featured soaring colonnaded terraces that seemed to grow out of the very limestone cliffs of the Theban hills. But her vision extended far beyond the borders of Egypt and the construction of stone monuments. In the 9th year of her reign, she commissioned a legendary trading expedition to the land of Punt, located somewhere along the coast of East Africa. 5 massive ships returned to Thebes, heavily laden with gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals. Most importantly, they brought back living frankincense trees that were planted in the courts of her temple. This was a golden age of prosperity, where the wealth of the empire was used to enrich the gods and the people. But while the Queen King built her monuments, the young Thutmose III was growing into a man in the shadow of the throne. He spent his youth not in the luxury of the court, but in the harsh training camps of the Egyptian army. He became a master of the chariot, a skilled archer, and a brilliant strategist who understood the mechanics of war. Hatshepsut died in 1458 BCE, perhaps from a chronic illness or the complications of a life spent breaking barriers. With her passing, the Napoleon of Egypt finally stepped into the light to claim his birthright. Thutmose III ascended to sole power and immediately faced a massive coalition of rebels in the north. The king of Kadesh had gathered over 300 Syrian lords at the city of Megiddo to challenge the Egyptian empire. Thutmose III did not hesitate, leading his army on a lightning march of 10 days to reach the enemy camp. Against the advice of his seasoned generals, he chose to lead his troops through a narrow, dangerous mountain pass. He caught the coalition by surprise, appearing on the plain of Megiddo while they still expected him to take the main road. The Battle of Megiddo was a crushing victory for Egypt, though the city itself held out for 7 long months under siege. Thutmose III proved to be a relentless warrior, conducting 17 military campaigns over the course of 20 years. He crossed the Euphrates River on collapsible boats and hunted elephants in the marshes of Syria. He extended the empire to its greatest extent, stretching from the banks of the Euphrates to the 4th cataract of the Nile in Sudan. But as he grew older, a dark and vengeful impulse took hold of the aging conqueror. He ordered that the name and image of Hatshepsut be systematically erased from every temple and monument in the land. Statues were smashed, her name was chiseled away, and walls were built to hide her obelisks from public view. He sought to rewrite history, making it appear as though the crown had passed directly from his father to himself. However, stone remembers what men try to forget, and her legacy survived in the hidden corners of her great temple. Thutmose III died in 1425 BCE, leaving behind an empire that was the undisputed superpower of the ancient world. The throne passed to his son, Amenhotep II, a man who inherited his father's physical strength but lacked his strategic patience. Amenhotep II was famous for his athletic prowess, supposedly shooting arrows through copper targets while driving a chariot. But he was also a brutal ruler, hanging the bodies of defeated rebel kings from the prow of his royal barge to terrify his subjects. He died in 1401 BCE, passing the crown to his son, Thutmose IV, who gained the throne through a divine omen. According to the dream stele placed between the paws of the great Sphinx, the sun god promised him the crown if he cleared the desert sands from the monument. Thutmose IV honored the bargain and reigned for a decade of relative peace and diplomatic marriages. But as the Thutmoside line continued, the empire reached a tipping point of unprecedented luxury. The warrior kings were about to be replaced by a monarch who preferred the pleasures of the palace to the dust of the battlefield. The sun was reaching its zenith, but a shadow was beginning to fall over the house of the pharaohs. The death of Thutmose IV in 1391 BCE marked the beginning of a reign that would redefine the meaning of majesty. His son, Amenhotep III, ascended to the throne at the age of 12, inheriting an empire at its absolute zenith. He did not come to the throne as a warrior, but as a god-king destined to preside over an era of unprecedented luxury. His mother, Mutemwia, acted as regent in his early years, ensuring the stability of the Thutmoside line. But Amenhotep III soon made it clear that he would not be bound by the traditional constraints of the palace. In the second year of his reign, he married Tie, a woman of non-royal birth from a powerful provincial family. Tai was not merely a consort, she was a political force, appearing in statues and inscriptions as the king's equal. She was the first queen to have her name regularly included on official royal documents and scarabs. But while the court basked in the warmth of the royal couple, the focus of the state was shifting. Amenhotep III became known as the Sun King, a monarch who sought to radiate the power of the solar disk across the world. He moved away from the military camps of his ancestors and into the sprawling palace complex of Malkata. This dazzling A10 palace was a city unto itself, filled with artificial lakes, gardens, and gilded halls. But his true legacy was carved into the golden sandstone of Thebes and beyond. He commissioned the Luxor Temple, a magnificent structure dedicated to the rejuvenation of the royal car. He also expanded the Temple of Karnak, adding the massive third pylon and a forest of towering columns. His mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile was the largest religious complex ever built in Egypt. Today, only 2 giant statues remain of that colossal structure, the Colossi of Memnon. These 60-foot-tall figures of the king still stand as silent sentinels over the fields where his temple once sprawled. However, the wealth that funded these monuments did not come from conquest, but from clever diplomacy. Amenhotep III was a master of the Great Powers Club, maintaining a delicate balance with the kings of Babylon, Mitanni, and the Hittites. He used the gold of Egypt as a diplomatic weapon, famously telling foreign kings that gold was as common as dust in his land. But he refused to send Egyptian princesses abroad, maintaining the absolute prestige of the divine bloodline. The Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablets, reveal a world of intense diplomatic maneuvering and royal gift-giving. But as the decades passed, the Sun King began to experience the physical toll of his long and luxurious life. Forensic evidence from his mummy reveals a man who suffered from severe dental abscesses and painful arthritis. He became increasingly obsessed with his own divinity, celebrating 3 magnificent Heb-Sed festivals. During these festivals, he was ritually reborn and transformed into a living manifestation of the sun god while still on earth. He promoted the cult of the Aten, the physical disk of the sun, perhaps to counter the growing power of the priests of Amun. But this religious experimentation was a quiet fire that his son would eventually turn into a conflagration. By the end of his 38-year reign, Amenhotep III was a frail figure, hidden away in the shadows of his golden palace. The administration was largely handled by Queen Tiye and the aging viziers of the court. Amenhotep III died in 1353 BCE, passing the wealthiest and most stable empire in history to his son, Amenhotep IV. But the young king did not share his father's love for the traditional gods or the old capital of Thebes. The stability of the new kingdom was about to be shattered by a religious revolution that would bring the empire to its knees. The age of the heretic king had arrived. Amenhotep IV ascended to the throne of Egypt in 1353 BCE, inheriting the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. But the young king did not share his father's temperament or his devotion to the ancient gods of Thebes. For centuries, the priesthood of Amun had grown so wealthy and influential that they rivaled the pharaoh himself in power. Amenhotep IV watched as the priests dictated the spiritual life of the nation, and he grew resentful of their shadow. In the 5th year of his reign, he made a move that sent shockwaves through the Nile Valley. He abandoned his birth name and declared himself Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. He proclaimed that there was only one true god, the Aten, the physical disk of the sun that gave life to all things. But this was not just a religious shift. It was a total dismantling of the Egyptian world order. He ordered the closure of the ancient temples and the systematic erasure of the name of Amun from every monument in the land. However, the priests were not his only targets. He also abandoned the sacred city of Thebes. He led a massive exodus of his court into the middle of the desert to build a new capital from scratch. This city was called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna. It was a city built of sun-baked brick and white limestone, designed with open roof temples so the sun's rays could reach the altars. But the revolution was not just in the heavens, it was in the very way the king was seen by his people. Akhenaten discarded the idealized muscular portraits of his ancestors for a new, realistic style of art. He was depicted with an elongated head, a thin neck, and a protruding belly, emphasizing his humanity over his divinity. At his side stood his great royal wife, Nefertiti, a woman whose beauty and power became legendary. Nefertiti was more than a queen. She was a CO ruler who participated in the sacred rituals and drove her own chariot. But while the royal family basked in the light of the Aten at Amarna, the empire outside was beginning to crumble. Akhenaten was a man possessed by his religious vision, and he neglected the frantic pleas for help from his vassals in the north. The Hittites, a rising power in Anatolia, began to swallow Egyptian territories in Syria and the Levant. The Amarna letters record the desperate cries of local governors who were being decimated by invaders while the pharaoh remained silent. But the domestic turmoil was even greater, as the common people were forced to abandon the gods who had protected their families for generations. The economy, which relied on the temple networks, began to stagnate under the weight of the religious ban. However, the Amarna revolution could not survive the man who created it. In the later years of his reign, Akhenaten became increasingly isolated, perhaps mourning the death of several of his daughters. Nefertiti's fate becomes a mystery in the records, leading some to believe she ruled briefly as a king under the name Neferuaten. Akhenaten died in 1332 BCE, leaving behind a city that would soon be reclaimed by the desert and a people who were eager to forget his name. He had tried to change the soul of a nation, but he had only succeeded in creating a vacuum of power. The crown passed to the mysterious Smenkhkare, whose brief reign is a shadow in the historical record. But the true hope of the traditionalists rested on the shoulders of a small boy, the son of the heretic. The restoration of the old world was about to begin, led by a child whose name would one day be known by every corner of the globe. The heretic Akhenaten was dead, leaving behind a kingdom in spiritual and political ruins. The radical experiment of Amarna had failed, and the empire was reeling from decades of neglect. In 1332 BCE, a 9-year-old boy named Tutankhaten ascended the throne, carrying the weight of a shattered empire on his young shoulders. He was likely the son of Akhenaten, born into the strange, sun-drenched halls of the new capital in the desert. But the boy was not the one truly holding the scepter. The real power rested with two men who had survived the purges of the previous reign, the aging Vizier Ay and the ambitious general Horemheb. They saw that the revolution of the Aten had brought Egypt to the brink of collapse, and they knew the gods of old were angry. Under their stern guidance, the young king made a move to reconcile with the priesthood and the people. He changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, signaling the return of the hidden god Amun to his rightful place. Tutankhamun issued the Restoration Stele, a massive decree erected in temples across the land. The text declared that the temples of the gods had been turned into ruins and their shrines into overgrown footpaths. It claimed that because the gods were ignored, the army had failed in every campaign, and the heavens were closed to Egypt. But words were not enough. The court needed to move. Tutankhamun and his advisors abandoned the city of Amarna, leaving its white limestone walls to be reclaimed by the scorching sands. The capital was returned to Memphis, while the religious heart of the nation was restored to Thebes. The young king spent his short reign reopening the great temples and commissioning new statues of the old gods. He married Ankhesenamun, his half-sister and the daughter of Nefertiti, to ensure the legitimacy of the Thutmosid bloodline. However, the military situation in the north was still desperate. General Horemheb led the Egyptian forces into the Levant, trying to check the expansion of the Hittite Empire. But the years of Akhenaten's pacifism had allowed the Hittites to become too strong, and the conflict became a grinding stalemate. Inside the palace, Tutankhamun was growing into a young man, but his health was a constant source of concern for the court. Modern forensic analysis of his mummy reveals a king who suffered from a cleft palate, a club foot, and frequent bouts of malaria. He was likely a frail figure, walking with the aid of the hundreds of ornate canes later found in his tomb. But his life was cut tragically short before he could produce an heir. Tutankhamun died suddenly in 1323 BCE at the age of 18, ending the direct male line of the 18th dynasty. His death was a moment of absolute national crisis. He was buried in a small, hastily prepared tomb in the Valley of the Kings, packed with treasures that were originally meant for someone else. But the vacuum of power he left behind was terrifying. His widow, Queen Ankhesenamun, found herself surrounded by ambitious men who wanted her crown. In a desperate, unprecedented move, she wrote a secret letter to the king of the Hittites. She pleaded with him to send one of his sons to Egypt, promising to marry him and make him pharaoh. The Hittite king was stunned, but he eventually sent Prince Zananza to claim the Egyptian throne. However, the prince never reached the Nile. He was murdered on the border, likely on the orders of the Egyptian military. With the last hope of the royal line dead, the Vizier Ay made his move. Ay ascended the throne in 1323 BCE, despite being a commoner and a man of advanced years. He married the widowed queen to give himself a thin veneer of legitimacy, but his reign was viewed by many as an act of usurpation. Aae died in 1319 BCE after only 4 years on the throne, passing the crown to the man who had been waiting in the shadows. Horemheb, the great commander of the army, was crowned Pharaoh of Egypt. He was not of royal blood, but he possessed the iron will and the military might to enforce his rule. He presented himself as the man chosen by the god Horus to restore Ma'at, the divine balance, to the world. But Horemheb did not just want to restore the old ways, he wanted to destroy the memory of the heretics. He launched a systematic campaign of damnatio memoriae, erasing the names of Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and Ai from the official records. He tore down the temples of the Aten and used the stones as rubble to fill the pylons of his own projects at Karnak. Horemheb enacted a series of brutal legal reforms known as the Great Edict. He promised to cut out the tongues of corrupt officials and sent tax collectors who cheated the people to the harsh mines of the south. He spent his 27-year reign scrubbing the Amarna period from history and rebuilding the shattered bureaucracy. But Horemheb had no children of his own to inherit the empire he had saved. He looked to his closest companion, a fellow general named Paramessu, and appointed him as his co-regent and heir. Horemheb died in 1292 BCE, passing the throne to Paramessu, who ascended as Ramesses I. This transition marked the birth of the 19th dynasty, the house of the Ramesside kings. The age of the restorer was over, and the age of the warrior kings was about to begin. The new dynasty was hungry for the glory that had been lost, and they were ready to bathe the world in fire to get it. The death of Horemheb left a crown, but no royal bloodline to wear it. Ramesses I ascended the throne in 1292 BCE, a veteran general and a companion in arms to the previous king. He was already a man of advanced years, and he understood that his primary duty was to establish the legitimacy of the 19th dynasty. He appointed his son Seti as co-regent and commander of the army to ensure a seamless transition of power. Ramesses I died in 1290 BCE after a reign of only 16 months, passing the throne to Seti I. Seti I was a man of iron and stone, determined to restore the imperial borders to the glory days of Thutmose III. He was a tireless campaigner, leading his chariots into the Levant to reclaim the city-states that had drifted away during the Amarna years. Seti I was the first pharaoh in generations to face the Hittites in open battle, capturing the strategic city of Kadesh. But his victories were not limited to the battlefield. He was a master builder who commissioned the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, a forest of 134 massive columns that still dazes the modern traveler. He also constructed a magnificent temple at Abydos, featuring some of the finest relief carvings in all of Egyptian history. However, Seti I knew that his time was limited, and he spent years preparing his son for the burdens of the crown. Seti I died in 1279 BCE, passing the empire to his son Ramesses II, who would become the most famous pharaoh to ever live. Ramesses II was young, handsome, and possessed an ego that matched the scale of the monuments he would eventually build. He was not content to merely hold the borders, he wanted to crush the Hittite Empire once and for all. In the 5th year of his reign, Ramesses II marched north with an army of 20,000 men, divided into 4 divisions named after the gods. But as he approached the city of Kadesh, he was deceived by Hittite spies who claimed the enemy was far to the north. Ramesses II raced ahead with his personal guard, leaving the rest of his army miles behind. It was a trap. The Hittite king Mu'tali II launched a massive chariot assault, catching the division of Amun by surprise and nearly capturing the pharaoh himself. But Ramesses II did not flee. He reportedly charged into the fray alone, calling upon the god Amun to give him strength. The arrival of elite Egyptian reinforcements saved the day, turning a potential massacre into a bloody stalemate. However, upon his return to Egypt, Ramesses II did not tell the truth. He covered the walls of every major temple with epic poems and carvings depicting his solitary victory over the Hittite host. But the reality of the war was far more pragmatic. In 1258 BCE, after years of continued skirmishes, Ramesses II signed the world's first recorded peace treaty with the Hittites. The two empires agreed to a permanent alliance and a mutual defense pact, a treaty that was later sealed by the pharaoh's marriage to a Hittite princess. With peace secured in the north, Ramesses II turned his focus to immortalizing his name in stone. He built a new capital in the delta called Pi-Ramesses, a glittering city of turquoise tiles and vast military barracks. But his most ambitious project was carved into the living rock of the mountains in deep Nubia. Abu Simbel featured 4 60-foot-tall statues of the king, designed so that the sun's rays would illuminate the inner sanctuary twice a year. But Ramesses II was not just a builder of temples, he was a builder of a massive royal family. He lived for over 90 years, fathering more than 100 children with his dozens of wives and concubines. His favorite wife, Queen Nefertari, was honored with a tomb in the Valley of the Queens that remains the most beautiful in the Theban necropolis. As the decades wore on, the great Ramesses became a living relic of a bygone age. He outlived 12 of his own sons and watched as the empire he had built began to show the first cracks of exhaustion. The weight of maintaining such a massive military and building program had begun to drain the royal treasury. But the pharaoh remained a god on earth, presiding over festivals and maintaining the facade of absolute power. Ramesses II died in 1213 BCE, leaving the throne to his 13th son, Merneptah. The transition was peaceful, but the world was changing rapidly outside the borders of the Nile. A mysterious wave of invaders was gathering in the Mediterranean, and the long, slow decay of the new kingdom was about to begin. Merneptah ascended to the throne in 1213 BCE, already an elderly man who had spent decades waiting in the shadow of his legendary father. But the world he inherited was no longer the stable empire of Ramesses the Great. To the west, Libyan tribes were migrating into the delta, driven by a mysterious pressure from further inland. They were not alone. A shadowy coalition of maritime raiders, known as the Sea Peoples, had begun to harass the Mediterranean coasts. In the 5th year of his reign, Merneptah faced a massive invasion of Libyans, joined by Shardana, Lucca, and Eqesh mercenaries. He met them at the Battle of Perire, where Egyptian archers decimated the invaders in a 6-hour slaughter. But the victory only provided a temporary reprieve from a changing world. Merneptah died in 1203 BCE, and with his passing, the House of Ramesses collapsed into a bitter civil war. Seti II took the throne, but his legitimacy was immediately challenged by a usurper named Amenmesse. Amenmesse seized control of Upper Egypt and Nubia, effectively splitting the kingdom in half for several years. Seti II eventually reclaimed the south, erasing his rival's name from the monuments in a fit of dynastic rage. However, the 19th dynasty was now mortally wounded by its own internal rot. When Seti II died in 1197 BCE, the crown passed to Siptah, a young boy with a withered leg who was little more than a puppet for the court. The true power rested with the Chancellor Bey, a Syrian official who had risen to unprecedented heights of influence. Bey was eventually executed for treason, leaving the throne to Queen Tausret, the final ruler of the dynasty. Tausret reigned as a female pharaoh, but she could not stop the slide into anarchy. The 19th dynasty vanished in a cloud of mystery and civil strife around 1189 BCE. Order was briefly restored by Setnakhte, a man of unknown origins who founded the 20th dynasty. He drove out the foreign factions that had occupied the palace and reigned for only 3 years before passing the crown to his son. Ramesses III ascended the throne in 1184 BCE, and he would become the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom. He was a man who consciously modeled himself after Ramesses II, but he faced threats that would have tested the limits of his predecessor. The Bronze Age collapse was in full swing, and entire civilizations across the Mediterranean were being erased from the map. But Egypt stood alone as the final bastion of order. In the 8th year of his reign, the Sea Peoples returned in a massive migration of ships and ox carts, intent on total conquest. They had already destroyed the Hittite Empire and the cities of the Levant. But Ramesses III was ready for them. He lured the Sea Peoples' fleet into the narrow mouths of the Nile Delta, where his hidden archers waited on the banks. The Egyptian navy, equipped with grappling hooks and massive stones, engaged the enemy in the world's first recorded naval battle. The Sea Peoples were decimated, their bodies clogging the river, and their threat to the Egyptian heartland ended forever. However, the cost of these wars was staggering, and the royal treasury was empty. But the problems were not just financial, they were environmental. Volcanic eruptions in the Mediterranean led to a cooling climate, causing crop failures and rising grain prices. In the 29th year of his reign, the workers at the Valley of the Kings staged the first recorded labor strike in history because their rations had not arrived. But the final blow to Ramesses III did not come from a foreign army or a hungry worker. It came from within his own harem. Queen Tiye, one of his secondary wives, hatched a conspiracy to assassinate the king and place her son Pentawer on the throne. The conspirators used black magic and palace insiders to strike at the aging pharaoh. Ramesses III died in 1155 BCE, his throat slit by an assassin's blade during the coup. But the conspiracy failed to seize the throne, as the rightful heir, Ramesses IV, acted quickly to secure the capital. The judicial papyrus of Turin records the trials of the conspirators, many of whom were forced to commit suicide. However, the death of Ramesses III marked the end of Egypt's imperial vitality. The following decades saw a succession of kings, all named Ramesses, who presided over a terminal decline. Ramesses IV tried to maintain the building programs, but he died after 6 years of frustrated ambition. Ramesses V followed, only to die of smallpox, leaving a kingdom plagued by inflation and Libyan raids. But as the pharaohs in the north grew weaker, the high priests of Amun in Thebes grew stronger. The high priest Herihor eventually took on royal titles in the south, effectively ruling Upper Egypt as a separate state. By the reign of Ramesses XI, the last king of the 20th dynasty, the pharaoh was a prisoner in his own palace at Ramesses. The empire in the Levant was gone. The gold mines of Nubia were lost, and the temples were being looted by their own guards. Grave robberies became an epidemic, as even the bodies of the great pharaohs were stripped of their gold to pay for a dying state. Ramesses XI died in 1069 BCE, and with him the new kingdom, the era of empire and gold, breathed its last. The throne was seized by Smendes, a merchant official who founded the 21st dynasty from the northern city of Tanis. But the high priests in Thebes refused to acknowledge his absolute authority. Egypt was once again a land of two masters. The third intermediate period had begun, and the sun was setting on the age of the native giants. The era of the great imperial giants was over, and Egypt was now a house divided against itself. Smendes ascended the throne in 1069 BCE, ruling from the northern city of Tanis. But his authority stopped at the gates of Middle Egypt. In the south, the high priests of Amun at Thebes ruled as independent monarchs in all but name. Herihor, the high priest, had died shortly before the transition, passing his spiritual and political mantle to Piank. The north and south maintained a fragile peace through marriage and mutual necessity. Smendes died in 1043 BCE, passing the northern crown to Amenemnisu, who reigned for only 4 years. He was followed by Psusenes I, known to history as the Silver Pharaoh. Psusenes I was a master of survival, reigning for 46 years and building a massive fortress temple at Tanis. His wealth was staggering, buried in a coffin of solid silver to protect his body from the humidity of the delta. Even the Silver Pharaoh could not stop the demographic tide shifting in the north. For centuries, Libyan tribes had been settling in the delta as mercenaries and laborers. By the time Psusenes died in 991 BCE, these Libyans held the highest positions in the Egyptian military. The crown passed to Amenemope, who continued the struggle to maintain a crumbling economy. But central authority was so weak that the royal tombs in Thebes were being systematically emptied to fund the northern court. Amenemope died in 984 BCE, followed by the brief reign of Osorkon the Elder, the first king of Libyan descent. He was succeeded by Siamun, who famously campaigned in Philistia and gave his daughter in marriage to King Solomon of Israel. Siamun's death in 959 BCE left the throne to Psusenes II, the final king of the 21st dynasty. With his passing in 943 BCE, the pretense of native rule in the north finally evaporated. Shoshenq I was a powerful Libyan chieftain who ascended the throne and founded the 22nd dynasty. He was a man of immense ambition, determined to restore the prestige of the new kingdom. Shoshenq I launched a massive military campaign into Judah and Israel and sacked the temple in Jerusalem. He returned to Egypt laden with gold, which he used to fund a new building program at Karnak. But the unity he brought was short-lived. Shoshenq I died in 922 BCE and passed the throne to his son Osorkon I. Osorkon I was a pious ruler who donated tons of gold and silver to the temples. However, under his successors, Takalot I and Osorkon II, the Libyan great chiefs in the delta began to act like independent kings. By 837 BCE, the kingdom had fractured into the 23rd dynasty, a rival Libyan line ruling from Leontopolis. But a new and more pious threat was gathering in the far south. In the land of Kush, modern-day Sudan, a line of native kings had emerged who saw themselves as the true protectors of the god Amun. Around 744 BCE, the Kushite king Pai ascended the throne of Napata. He watched with disgust as the Libyan chiefs in Egypt allowed the sacred temples to fall into disrepair. Pai launched a holy war of liberation, leading his Nubian archers down the Nile. He was a king of unique character, famous for his love of horses and his refusal to kill enemies who surrendered. Pai defeated the coalition of Libyan princes led by Tefnakht of Sais. After his victory, Pai did not stay to rule. He returned to Kush, leaving Egypt to its own devices. This power vacuum allowed Tefnakht to found the 24th dynasty, but his son Bakan Ranef was soon captured and burned alive by the returning Nubians. Shabaka, the brother of Pai, ascended the throne in 714 BCE and firmly established the 25th dynasty. These were the Black Pharaohs who brought a renaissance of Old Kingdom art and religion back to the Nile. Shabaka was followed by Shebitku, who faced the rising shadow of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the east. But the greatest of the Kushite kings was Taharqa, who ascended the throne in 690 BCE. Taharqa was a builder on a grand scale, erecting massive columns and monuments from Kush to the Delta. However, his reign was defined by a brutal, decades-long struggle with Assyria. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon launched a full-scale invasion in 671 BCE, capturing Memphis and forcing Taharqa to flee to the south. But Taharqa was relentless, launching counterattacks every time the Assyrian army withdrew. The final blow came under the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. In 663 BCE, the Assyrians marched all the way to Thebes, the sacred city of Amun. They sacked the city, stripping the gold from the temples and carrying away 2 massive obelisks as trophies. The 25th dynasty was decimated, and the Kushites were driven back behind the cataracts of the south. The Assyrians did not wish to rule Egypt directly, so they installed a puppet governor named Psamtik. But Psamtik was a man of deep cunning and patience. He used Greek and Carian mercenaries to slowly consolidate his power and drive out the Assyrian garrisons. By 664 BCE, Psamtik I had founded the 26th dynasty, based in the city of Sais. This Saitic renaissance saw a brief return to stability and a revival of ancient artistic styles. Psamtik I died in 610 BCE, passing a wealthy and independent Egypt to his son, Necho II. Necho II was a visionary who attempted to dig a canal between the Nile and the Red Sea. He also sent a Phoenician fleet to circumnavigate the continent of Africa. However, he was defeated by the Babylonians at the Battle of Carchemish, ending Egypt's dreams of regaining an empire in Syria. Necho II died in 595 BCE, passing the throne to Psamtik II, who focused on a military campaign into Nubia to ensure the Kushites never returned. He was followed by Wahibre, known to the Greeks as Apries. Apries was an unpopular king who relied too heavily on Greek mercenaries, leading to a military revolt. He was overthrown by his own general, Ahmose II, known to history as Amasis. Amasis was a jovial and clever ruler who presided over the final golden age of the Saitic period. But the world was changing again. The Babylonians had fallen to a new superpower, the Persians. Amasis died in 526 BCE, leaving a terrifying inheritance to his son, Psamtik III. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II crossed the Sinai Desert with a massive host. The Egyptian army was crushed at the Battle of Pelusium, reportedly because the Persians used cats, sacred to the Egyptians, as shields. Psamtik III was captured and later executed, marking the end of the 26th dynasty. The native crown was gone. Egypt was now a mere province of the Persian Empire, a satrapy ruled by a foreign king in a distant land. But the spirit of the Nile was not so easily broken. The year 525 BCE marked the beginning of a long and bitter chapter in the history of the Nile. Cambyses II, the King of Kings, had transformed Egypt into a satrapy of the massive Persian Empire. He was a ruler who lacked the diplomatic touch of his father, Cyrus the Great. Ancient accounts, perhaps biased, describe Cambyses as a madman who stabbed the sacred Apis bull and mocked the ancient gods. But whether he was a tyrant or a victim of propaganda, his reign was short and haunted by internal Persian strife. Cambyses II died in 522 BCE under mysterious circumstances, allegedly from a self-inflicted wound while mounting his horse. The Persian throne was eventually seized by Darius I, known to history as Darius the Great. Darius was a more pragmatic master of the Egyptian province. He understood that to rule Egypt, he had to appear as a pharaoh. He commissioned the completion of the canal from the Nile to the Red Sea, a project Necho II had started but never finished. Darius also built the great temple of Hybis in the Karga oasis, showing a level of respect for Egyptian religion that Cambyses lacked. But the Egyptians were a people with a long memory, and they did not enjoy being the subjects of a distant master in Susa. When the Persians were defeated by the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, the Egyptians saw a glimmer of hope. A massive revolt broke out in the delta, led by a local chieftain named Ariandes. However, Darius I died in 486 BCE, passing the problem and the crown to his son, Xerxes I. Xerxes was a man of fire and fury, and he had no patience for Egyptian rebellion. He crushed the revolt with brutal efficiency and stripped the Egyptian temples of their remaining wealth to fund his invasion of Greece. The Persian yoke was becoming heavier with every passing year. Xerxes I was assassinated in 465 BCE, and the empire passed to Artaxerxes I. During his reign, a Libyan prince named Inaros launched a massive rebellion with the help of the Athenian fleet. The rebels successfully besieged Memphis, but the Persians eventually sent a massive relief force that decimated the Greeks and the Egyptians alike. Inaros was captured and taken to Persia, where he was eventually crucified. Even so, the spirit of resistance had become a permanent feature of the Egyptian landscape. The 27th dynasty, the first period of Persian rule, finally collapsed in 404 BCE, following the death of Darius II. Amyrtaeus, a native Egyptian from the delta city of Sais, declared himself pharaoh and founded the 28th dynasty. He was the only king of his line, and he spent his entire 6-year reign fighting to clear the last Persian garrisons from the land. However, his victory was short-lived. In 399 BCE, he was overthrown and executed by Nepherites I, who founded the 29th dynasty. Nepherites I moved the capital to Mendes and sought to rebuild the Egyptian military with Greek mercenaries. He died in 393 BCE, passing the crown to his son, Hakkor. Hakkor was a vigorous ruler who successfully fended off several Persian attempts to reconquer the Nile. But the internal politics of Egypt were becoming as volatile as the world outside. Hakkor died in 380 BCE, and after a year of chaos, the throne was seized by Nectanebo I. Nectanebo I founded the 30th dynasty, which would be the very last line of native Egyptian kings to rule their own land. He was a master strategist who defeated a massive Persian and Greek invasion in 373 BCE by using the Nile floods as a weapon. He submerged the delta, trapping the invaders in the mud and forcing them to retreat in disgrace. Nectanebo I died in 362 BCE, passing the throne to Teos. Teos was an ambitious king who launched a daring invasion of Persian-controlled Syria, but he was betrayed by his own family. His nephew, Nectanebo II, seized the crown while Teos was on campaign. Nectanebo II was a pious man and a great patron of the arts, but he was the last of his kind. In 343 BCE, the Persian king Artaxerxes III launched a final overwhelming invasion. The Egyptian defenses collapsed at the Battle of Pelusium. Nectanebo II fled to the south and then vanished into the kingdom of Kush, taking the independence of Egypt with him. The 31st dynasty was a brief, dark period of Second Persian rule, marked by heavy taxes and religious persecution. But the Persians themselves were now being stalked by a greater predator from the west. In 334 BCE, a young Macedonian king named Alexander crossed the Hellespont and began to dismantle the Persian Empire. By 332 BCE, Alexander the Great had reached the gates of Egypt, but he did not come as a conqueror. He came as a deliverer. The Egyptians welcomed him with open arms, and the Persian satraps surrendered without a single drop of blood being spilled. Alexander marched to the oasis of Siwa, where the oracle of Amun proclaimed him the true son of the god and the rightful pharaoh. He founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, a city destined to become the intellectual center of the world. But Alexander was a man of the world, not just of Egypt. He left the land in 331 BCE to complete his conquest of Persia, never to return alive. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, leaving his vast empire to be torn apart by his generals. The general Ptolemy, a close friend and bodyguard of Alexander, was appointed governor of Egypt. However, Ptolemy did not want to be a governor. He wanted to be a king. He hijacked Alexander's funeral cortege and brought the body of the conqueror back to Egypt for burial. By 305 BCE, Ptolemy I had officially declared himself pharaoh. A new era of Greek rule had begun, one that would blend the traditions of the Nile with the philosophy of the Aegean. The house of the Ptolemies was now in power, and the stage was set for the final tragic act of ancient Egyptian history. Ptolemy I had successfully carved his own kingdom from the ruins of Alexander's empire. He understood that to rule the Egyptians, he could not simply be a foreign occupier, he had to be a successor to the divine pharaohs. Ptolemy I established the capital at Alexandria, a city of marble and light that became the envy of the Mediterranean. He founded the Great Library of Alexandria, a repository of all the world's knowledge, and the Museum, a temple to the muses where scholars gathered to study. But he also needed a bridge between Greek and Egyptian souls. He promoted the cult of Serapis, a deity that combined the Greek features of Zeus with the Egyptian attributes of Osiris and Apis. Ptolemy I died in 282 BCE, passing the throne to his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Ptolemy II was a man of immense wealth and intellectual curiosity who turned Alexandria into the cultural capital of the world. He commissioned the construction of the Pharos of Alexandria, a massive lighthouse that stood over 350 feet tall and was counted among the Seven Wonders. He also ordered the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, a project known as the Septuagint. But Ptolemy II also introduced a controversial practice that would define his dynasty, the marriage of siblings. He married his own sister, Arsinoe II, to consolidate royal power and mimic the divine marriages of the Egyptian gods. Ptolemy II died in 246 BCE, leaving a prosperous kingdom to his son, Ptolemy III Euergetes. Ptolemy III was a warrior king who led his armies deep into the Seleucid Empire, reclaiming statues of Egyptian gods that had been stolen by the Persians centuries earlier. Under his reign, the Ptolemaic Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, controlling parts of Libya, Syria, and Asia Minor. But the Golden Age was about to lose its luster. Ptolemy III died in 222 BCE, passing the crown to his son, Ptolemy IV Philopator. Ptolemy IV was a weak and decadent ruler who preferred the company of poets and dancers to the business of state. he allowed the administration to be handled by corrupt advisors who alienated the native Egyptian population. During his reign, a massive native revolt broke out in Upper Egypt, led by a line of rebel pharaohs who ruled from Thebes for 20 years. Ptolemy IV died in 204 BCE under mysterious circumstances, and the court was plunged into a bloody scramble for power. The throne was placed on the head of the 5-year-old Ptolemy V Epiphanes. During his minority, the empire's foreign territories were picked apart by rival Greek kings. To secure the loyalty of the Egyptian priesthood, the young king issued the Rosetta Stone, a decree written in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. Ptolemy V was eventually poisoned by his own courtiers in 180 BCE, passing the crown to his son, Ptolemy VI Philometor. Ptolemy VI faced a new and terrifying reality: the rise of Rome. The Republic began to intervene in Egyptian affairs, treating the Ptolemies as client kings rather than independent sovereigns. The dynasty descended into a series of brutal family feuds. Ptolemy VIII Physcon, a man described as morbidly obese and cruel, overthrew his own brother and married his sister and then his niece. He launched a purge of the Alexandrian intelligentsia, forcing the city's scholars to flee to other lands. By the 1st century BCE, the Ptolemaic house was a nest of vipers, with mothers, sons, and brothers constantly murdering one another for the crown. Ptolemy XII. Auletes, a man who loved the flute more than the scepter, was forced to bribe the Roman Senate with massive amounts of gold to keep his throne. He died in 51 BCE, leaving his kingdom to his 18-year-old daughter, Cleopatra VII, and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra was not just a beauty of legend, she was a polyglot, a brilliant diplomat, and the only Ptolemy to actually learn the Egyptian language. But her brother's advisors forced her into exile, leading to a civil war that coincided with the arrival of Julius Caesar in Alexandria. Cleopatra famously had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence inside a laundry bag, winning his military support and his heart. Caesar defeated the forces of Ptolemy XIII, who drowned in the Nile while trying to escape. Cleopatra was restored to the throne, eventually giving birth to Caesar's son, Caesarion. But after Caesar's assassination in Rome, she turned her sights to his successor in the east, Mark Antony. The two formed a political and romantic alliance that challenged the power of Octavian, Caesar's heir in Rome. The dream of an independent Egyptian Alexandrian empire was shattered at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's fleet crushed the forces of Antony and Cleopatra, forcing them to flee back to Alexandria. With Octavian's legions at the gates of the city, Mark Antony took his own life. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, chose to die by the bite of an asp in 30 BCE. Octavian ordered the execution of the young Caesarion, ending the line of the Ptolemies and the era of the pharaohs. The land of the Nile was no longer a kingdom. It was now the personal property of the Roman emperor, a granary to feed the hungry masses of the Italian peninsula. The ancient world was closing its eyes, and a new, more bureaucratic darkness was settling over the temples. With the death of Cleopatra, the last light of the pharaohs was extinguished, and the land of the Nile became the property of a single man in Rome. In 30 BCE, Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, declared Egypt his personal province, a territory so vital to the Roman Empire that no senator was allowed to visit without his express permission. The crown of the two lands was replaced by the cold, efficient hand of a Roman prefect. Cornelius Gallus was the first to hold this office, but his ego soon outpaced his station. He erected statues of himself and boasted of his achievements, leading Augustus to recall him in disgrace and driving Gallus to take his own life in 26 BCE. But despite the change in masters, the Nile continued to flow, and the grain of Egypt became the lifeblood of Rome. The annona, the grain dole, was the only thing keeping the Roman masses from rioting, and Egypt provided 1/3 of the city's total supply. The Romans had little interest in Egyptian culture, viewing the animal-headed gods as primitive and bizarre. They taxed the people with a ruthless efficiency that made the Ptolemaic exactions seem generous. Augustus died in 14 AD, passing the empire to Tiberius, who continued the policy of treating Egypt as a strategic granary. But beneath the surface of Roman order, a new and radical spiritual movement was beginning to take root. Tradition holds that in 42 AD, Saint Mark the Evangelist arrived in Alexandria, bringing the message of Christianity to the heart of the Mediterranean. The new faith spread rapidly among the oppressed native population, who found hope in a God who championed the poor and the weak. The Roman authorities saw this growing community as a threat to the cult of the emperor. Persecutions became a grim reality for the early Coptic Church, with thousands of martyrs dying in the arenas of Alexandria. Yet the faith only grew stronger in the shadows. In 66 AD, during the reign of Nero, a massive revolt broke out in Alexandria between the Greek and Jewish populations, leading to a Roman military intervention that left the city in flames. The throne in Rome changed hands frequently during the Year of the Four Kings, but stability returned with Vespasian in 69 AD. Vespasian was proclaimed emperor while he was in Alexandria, using his control of the grain supply to secure his claim to the throne. But as the centuries passed, the Roman Empire itself began to fracture. In 212 AD, the Emperor Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. But he also launched a brutal massacre in Alexandria after the citizens mocked him. The 3rd century saw Egypt plagued by the crisis of the 3rd century, with rampant inflation and frequent raids from the Ptolemies tribes in the south. In 270 AD, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra briefly conquered Egypt, defying the power of Rome for 2 years before the Emperor Aurelian reclaimed the province. However, the greatest shift occurred with the ascension of Diocletian in 284 AD. Diocletian launched the Great Persecution, a horrific attempt to wipe out Christianity that was so traumatic it became the starting point for the Coptic calendar. But Diocletian's successor, Constantine the Great, did the unthinkable. In 313 AD, Constantine legalized Christianity, and by the end of the century, it had become the official religion of the empire. The ancient temples of the pharaohs were closed, their priests scattered, and their hieroglyphs forgotten. In 391 AD, the Emperor Theodosius ordered the destruction of the Serapeum in Alexandria, signaling the final death of the old pagan world. But as Christianity became the law of the land, it also became a source of bitter internal conflict. Theological disputes over the nature of Christ divided the Egyptian church from the authorities in Constantinople. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD led to a permanent schism, as the Egyptian Coptic Church broke away from the Byzantine state. While the theologians argued the Byzantine Empire was growing weak and overextended. In 619 AD, the Sassanid Persians launched a surprise invasion, occupying Egypt for a decade and ending nearly 7 centuries of Roman peace. The Byzantines under Emperor Heraclius eventually won the land back, but they returned as exhausted and hated tax collectors. By 639 AD, a new power had emerged from the deserts of Arabia, carrying the banner of Islam. The Byzantine garrisons were no match for the speed and religious fervor of the Arab armies. In 641 AD, the fortress of Babylon in modern-day Cairo fell to the forces of Amr ibn al-As. The Roman era was over. The cross was being replaced by the crescent, and the language of the Nile was about to change forever. In 639 AD, a veteran general named Amr ibn al-As led a small force of 4,000 horsemen into the eastern frontiers of Egypt. He was a man of the desert, acting under the orders of the second caliph of Islam, Umar ibn al-Khattab. The Byzantine defenders in the fortress of Pelusium were shocked by the speed and the ferocity of the Arab cavalry. Amr ibn al-As understood that he was not just conquering a land, he was introducing a new world order. He bypassed the coastal cities and struck at the heart of the Roman administration at the fortress of Babylon. The siege lasted for 7 months, but the Byzantine governor, Cyrus, eventually realized that Constantinople would send no help. The fortress fell in 641 AD, and the Arab armies marched on Alexandria, the crown jewel of the Mediterranean. But the Byzantines abandoned the city by sea, leaving the keys to Egypt in the hands of the conquerors. Amr ibn al-As chose not to rule from Alexandria, which was too tied to the Roman world. Instead, he founded a new capital called Fustat, the city of the tents, located at the apex of the Nile Delta. He built the first mosque in Africa and offered the Coptic Christians a degree of religious freedom they had never enjoyed under the Byzantines. However, the taxes were still collected, and the wealth of the Nile now flowed toward the Caliphate in Medina. In 644 AD, Caliph Umar was assassinated, passing the mantle of the Islamic world to Uthman. Uthman replaced Amr ibn al-As with his own foster brother, sparking a period of administrative tension in Egypt. But the real shift occurred in 661 AD, when the Umayyad Caliphate was established in Damascus. Egypt became the most important province of the Umayyad Empire, serving as the primary source of revenue and grain. The Umayyad rulers were often seen as distant and aristocratic by the local population. In 750 AD, a bloody revolution swept the Islamic world, as the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads and moved the capital to Baghdad. The Abbasids brought a more Persian style of governance, but Egypt remained a restless and difficult province to manage. The central authority in Baghdad began to wither, and the local governors in Egypt saw their opportunity for independence. In 868 AD, a Turkish slave soldier named Ahmad ibn Tulun was sent to govern Egypt on behalf of the caliph. But Ibn Tulun was a man of massive ambition who had no intention of being a puppet. He declared independence and founded the Tulunid dynasty, the first independent dynasty of Islamic Egypt. He built a magnificent mosque in his new capital of Al-Qatai, a structure that remains one of the largest and oldest in Cairo. Al-Qatai stands as a lasting legacy. Ahmad ibn Tulun died in 884 AD, passing the throne to his son Kumarawai, who was known for his legendary extravagance. But the Tulunid wealth was soon exhausted, and the Abbasids briefly reclaimed Egypt in 905 AD. However, the chaos in the north allowed a new and more radical power to emerge from the deserts of North Africa. The Fatimids, a Shia dynasty claiming descent from the Prophet's daughter Fatima, launched a massive invasion of the Nile. In 969 AD, the Fatimid general Jawhar al-Sikili conquered Egypt and founded a new fortified capital. This conquest marked a decisive turning point. He called it Al-Qahira, the victorious, the city the world would eventually know as Cairo. The Fatimids established the Al-Azhar Mosque and University, which became the global center of Islamic learning. For 200 years, the Fatimid caliphs ruled Egypt with a level of splendor that rivaled the pharaohs of old. By the mid-12th century, the Fatimid court was paralyzed by harem intrigues and the rise of powerful viziers. The kingdom was vulnerable, caught between the rising power of the Crusaders in Jerusalem and the Zengid Turks in Syria. The final Fatimid Caliph Al-Adid was a mere figurehead, while his viziers fought for control. Into this chaos stepped a young Kurdish officer named Salah ad-Din, known to the West as Saladin. In 1171 AD, Saladin abolished the Fatimid Caliphate and declared himself Sultan of Egypt, founding the Ayyubid dynasty. He was a man of immense tactical skill and legendary chivalry. Saladin fortified Cairo, building the massive citadel that still dominates the city's skyline. He spent his reign fighting the Crusaders, famously recapturing Jerusalem in 1187. But Saladin's successors, the Ayyubid sultans, began to rely heavily on a new class of elite slave soldiers known as Mamluks. These were boys of Turkic and Caucasian origin, purchased in the slave markets and trained from childhood to be the perfect warriors. However, the Mamluks eventually realized that they were the ones holding the swords, while the Ayyubid princes held only the titles. In 1250 AD, following the death of Sultan as-Salih Ayyub, the Mamluks murdered his heir and seized the throne for themselves. The Sultanate was briefly held by a woman, Shajar al-Dur, the widow of the late Sultan. But the Mamluk generals refused to be ruled by a woman, and the throne passed to the commander Izz al-Din Aybak. This marked the beginning of the Mamluk Sultanate, a unique military meritocracy where the strongest general became king. In 1260 AD, the Mamluks faced their greatest challenge, the Mongol hordes of Hulagu Khan. The Mongols had already leveled Baghdad and were poised to sweep into Africa. But the Mamluk general Baybars met them at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine. In a stunning victory, Baybars decimated the Mongol vanguard, saving Egypt and the Islamic world from total destruction. Baybars became Sultan and reigned for 17 years, turning Egypt into the undisputed center of Islamic culture and power. But the Mamluk system was one of constant violence and sudden regime changes. Sultans were frequently assassinated by their own emirs, leading to a history of short, bloody reigns. Despite the instability at the top, the Mamluk era was a golden age of architecture, as every sultan sought to outdo his predecessor with grand mosques and madrasas. However, the 15th century brought the Black Death and a decline in Mediterranean trade routes. But the final blow came from the north. The Ottoman Empire had been expanding rapidly, and the Ottoman Sultan Selim I turned his sights on the wealth of the Nile. In 1517 AD, the Ottomans arrived with a weapon the Mamluks despised: gunpowder. The Mamluk cavalry, relying on traditional swordplay and bravery, was decimated by Ottoman cannons at the Battle of Ridaniya. The last Mamluk Sultan, Tuman Bey, was hanged at the gates of Cairo. Egypt was now a province of the Ottoman Empire, and the center of power had shifted once again, this time to Istanbul. The era of the medieval giants was over, and the long, slow transition to the modern age was beginning. The Ottoman conquest of 1517 changed the fate of Egypt, turning it from the heart of an empire into a mere province of the Sublime Porte. Sultan Selim I departed Cairo, leaving behind a military governor and a garrison of Janissaries to ensure the Nile's wealth flowed to Istanbul. But the Ottomans made a fateful decision to allow the surviving Mamluk emirs to retain their local power as tax collectors. This created a dual system of government, where the Ottoman Pasha and the Mamluk Beys constantly vied for control. For nearly 3 centuries, Egypt languished in a state of stagnant neglect, its ancient irrigation systems crumbling and its population decimated by plague. But the world outside was advancing into the industrial age, and the isolated province was about to be rediscovered. In 1798, a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte landed at Alexandria with an army of 35,000 men and a team of scientists. Napoleon sought to cut Britain's trade route to India, and he crushed the Mamluk cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids. However, the French occupation was a brief and bloody interlude, ending in 1801 when a combined British and Ottoman force drove them out. In the power vacuum that followed, a tobacco merchant turned soldier of fortune named Muhammad Ali seized the opportunity. Muhammad Ali Pasha ascended to power in 1805, officially recognized by the Sultan as the governor of Egypt. But he had no intention of being a servant. He was a visionary who wanted to build a modern dynasty. In 1811, he invited the remaining Mamluk leaders to a banquet at the citadel and had them all massacred, finally ending the medieval order. Muhammad Ali consolidated his power by nationalizing the land and building a modern army and navy based on European models. He introduced long-staple cotton, turning Egypt into a global agricultural powerhouse. He died in 1848, passing the throne to his grandson Abbas I, who reversed many of his grandfather's reforms. Abbas I was assassinated by his own guards in 1854, passing the crown to Said Pasha. It was during Said's reign that the Frenchman Ferdinand de Lesseps began the monumental task of digging the Suez Canal. But the project was a financial trap, and when Khedive Ismail the Magnificent took the throne in 1863, he inherited a mounting debt. Ismail wanted to make Egypt a part of Europe, building the Cairo Opera House and modernizing the city's infrastructure. However, the cost of the canal and his lavish lifestyle led to national bankruptcy. In 1879, the British and French forced the Sultan to depose Ismail, passing the throne to his weak son, Tawfiq. This foreign intervention sparked a nationalist revolt led by Colonel Ahmed Urabi. The British saw the Suez Canal as too vital to lose, and in 1882 they bombarded Alexandria and launched a full-scale invasion. The British occupation had begun, and for the next several decades, the Khedive was a mere puppet of the British High Commissioner. Tawfiq died in 1892, passing the title to Abbas II, who was eventually deposed by the British for his pro-Ottoman sympathies during World War I. The British declared Egypt a formal protectorate and installed Hussein Kamel as Sultan. But the spirit of independence was reaching a boiling point, led by the nationalist leader Saad Zaghloul. The 1919 revolution saw massive protests across the country, forcing the British to grant nominal independence in 1922. The Sultanate was transformed into a kingdom, and Fuad I became the first modern king of Egypt. Fuad I died in 1936, passing the throne to his 16-year-old son Farouk. King Farouk was initially popular, but his regime became synonymous with corruption, excess, and military failure. The humiliation of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War was the final straw for a group of young officers. On July 23, 1952, the Free Officers Movement, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, launched a bloodless coup. King Farouk was forced to abdicate and sail into exile, ending the dynasty of Muhammad Ali. The Republic of Egypt was declared, and Nasser emerged as the charismatic leader of the Arab world. In 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, surviving a joint British, French, and Israeli invasion known as the Suez Crisis. But his dream of pan-Arabism was shattered by the devastating defeat in 1967, the Six-Day War. Nasser died of a heart attack in 1970, passing the presidency to his deputy, Anwar Sadat. Sadat was a pragmatist who stunned the world by launching the 1973 October War and later signing a peace treaty with Israel. However, this move alienated much of the Arab world and led to his assassination by extremists in 1981. The vice president, Hosni Mubarak, assumed power and would rule Egypt with an iron hand for the next 30 years. Mubarak maintained a cold peace with Israel and a close alliance with the West, but the domestic economy stagnated. The youth of Egypt, connected by the internet and fueled by frustration, had seen enough. In January 2011, the Tahrir Square protests erupted, a massive wave of humanity demanding bread, freedom, and social justice. Mubarak was forced to step down, leading to a period of intense turmoil and the brief presidency of Mohamed Morsi. But the religious agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood sparked a second wave of mass protests in 2013. General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi intervened, removing Morsi from power and later being elected president in his own right. Today, Egypt stands as a nation caught between its ancient weight and its modern ambitions. The great Nile still flows, and the sun continues to bake the white stone of the new administrative capital rising from the desert. The smog of Cairo covers the city sky, and the history of Egypt is still being written.